And our part is to believe. By grace you're saved. That's what his part is. By grace you're saved through faith. And he says, and that not of yourselves, it's the gift of God. Constantly reminding us that it's not about us, it's not of ourselves, it's not something we acquire or earn or accomplish. Our part is simply that one little word, by faith. I like the message, that's Ephesians 2:8, by the way. I like what the message says there in Ephesians 2:8. It says, not of yourselves, it's the gift of God. The message says, we don't play the major role. If we did, we'd go around bragging about it. And that's very true. Okay, let's look at another passage in Romans chapter 5. I like this one. Romans chapter 5, and I think it helps us to see, number one, that it is a one-man plan, that it's all about Jesus, and then to see what it says exactly that he has done for us. And I want to begin a little bit before what I really want. I'm going to back up and read in, I think verse 6 is what I want. Just get a good run at it. Notice it says in verse 6, Romans. Did I say Romans? What did I say, Phil? Right, okay. I was quoting Ephesians. Romans chapter 5, verse 6 says, for when we were yet without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. Now, let me just stop there for a moment and say, in Hebrews, he talks about the Old Testament. He said in those former times, God spoke through the prophets and in different kinds of ways to the fathers, pointing out the fact that we're living in a different time than they lived in. In former times, in Old Testament times, a person that was ungodly, you know, what it says is, the soul that sinneth, it shall die. That's what Ezekiel says. That was the economy of the Old Testament. Individual guilt requires individual punishment. I meet people walking around today. In the New Testament that we're now living under grace, Paul says, you're not under the law but under grace. I meet people who say, I know I've got to pay for my sins. Not with God you don't. He's already... Did I read that right? It says, when we were yet without strength. You know what that means? That means when we had no ability to do anything about it. When we didn't have the capacity to do anything about it, in due time, at the appropriate time, Christ died. Now, see, the wages of sin is death, and the ungodly are supposed to die for their own sins. That's the Old Testament rule of things. You know, I think most Christians still carry around the baggage of that kind of thinking. That holy God and me, and we have an individual confrontation, and he's going to get me for what I've done wrong. But it says here, this is what I want to point out to you, that we're talking about a one-man plan. Jesus came and did for us what we could not do for ourselves. He remedied for us the situation that it says we're without strength. Christ died for the ungodly. Instead of, in due time, God got the ungodly, it said, all right, I'm going to get you now. He sent Christ to die for the ungodly. Now, a death had to happen. God's a just judge. He couldn't just wink and turn his head and say, well, I'll just, King's X, that doesn't count. There had to be a payment made. There had to be a death. The wages of sin is death. But God's plan, see, this is why we need to hear the gospel. This is why we need to keep hearing it, because it's counterintuitive. It goes against our intuition. Our intuition is there's a holy God and there's me, and I've got to pay. But the gospel tells us something that's counterintuitive, that although we're guilty and we should pay under a system of complete justice, God, in his mercy, has sent Jesus and he paid. In due time, Christ died for the ungodly. The next verse says, for scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet peradventure for a good man some would dare to die. In other words, it's almost inconceivable that somebody would take the place of another and die in their place. But it could be imagined, perhaps, in the case of a good man. But, it says in verse 8, God commends or introduces his love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. In other words, it's not that he said, well, boy, they're doing so great. They've almost got there, so I'll just come and do the little extra that they're lacking. I've talked to people who think that way, that we achieve our own righteousness and do as good as we can, and then whatever tiny little bit there might be in which we fall short, he makes up the difference. No, it's not that at all. He says his love towards us is introduced in that while we were complete sinners, totally alienated from him, that's when he died for us. Now, verse 9 says, much more then, in a more exaggerated way, being now justified by his blood. Justified means made right. We are made right not by anything we did, but by his blood, by his death. we shall be saved from wrath through him. Anytime you see the word wrath, especially in the writings of Paul, he means the just punishment for sin. That's what the word wrath, he always means that in it. That's his expression for it, punishment for sin. He says, because we're justified by his death, his blood, we are now confident that we're saved from punishment through him. For if, when we were enemies, we were reconciled. Notice that it says, this is really remarkable, when we were enemies, we were reconciled by the death of his Son. Now, notice it didn't say when we went to church one Sunday morning and heard the altar call and they sang Just As I Am and we responded and said, I'm going to receive Jesus, then we were reconciled. It says, while we were enemies, we were reconciled. Now, how can that be? How can it be that when we were enemies, we were reconciled? Well, it's because we didn't do the reconciling. He did it. It's a one-man plan. He did it for us. Now, we didn't know about it. But he did it already. When we were enemies, did I read it right? I'm not making it up, am I? When we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son. You see, Jesus died before we ever did anything about it. We come along later afterwards, and he's already made the reconciliation for us. He's already brought us into right standing. We just don't know about it yet. This is a very interesting concept. It's counterintuitive. For if, when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more, being reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. As Christians, embracing and recognizing that fact, he says, much more we need to know that we are saved by his life. And not only, and notice it's his life, not only so, but we also joy in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom we have now received the atonement, literally the reconciliation, by whom we've now received it. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, verse 12. Not that that was pretty good, but here's where it really gets interesting about the one-man plan. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. Now, the one man, of course, by whom sin entered the world is the man we read about in Genesis. His name is Adam. And he did what God told him not to do, and he ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he gained an instinctive knowledge that was handed down to all of us, that God is holy and I'm not. And I'm separated from God. And an instinctive, we might say, nature of sin, and a propensity towards sin. And you notice when it says that by one man sin entered into the world, and that nature of death passed upon all persons, all men. And then it says, for that. Now that could read, because of that. Because of that all sinned. That's why everyone is a sinner. It's because of Adam. Verse 13 says, for until the law was in the world, until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed where there's no law. In other words, the law fixes the penalty. Verse 14, nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those that had not sinned, after the similitude of Adam's transgression. In other words, even over those that didn't do exactly what Adam did. Death still reigned, because by one man, this death entered into the world. So it almost didn't make any difference what the individual people did after Adam. Death still reigned over them. Who is a figure of him who is to come. Now, how is Adam a figure of the one who is to come? He's going to explain that. But not as the offense, so also is the free gift. He's making a comparison, but he's making a negative comparison. That's because the free gift is so much greater and more powerful than the offense. The offense is from Adam. The free gift, of course, is from Christ. For if through the offense of one, notice the word one, for if through the offense of one many be dead, that means separated from God, just like Adam was. Much more, and again he makes this comparison, but it says it's so much greater what Christ has done. Much more the grace of God and the gift of grace, which is by one man, Jesus Christ, hath abounded unto many. You know what he's saying? He said, if what Adam did had an impact on everybody, how much more does what Jesus has done, how much more potent and powerful is that? Verse 16 said, and not as it was by the one that sinned, so is the gift. For the judgment, notice this word judgment, was by one to condemnation. Notice it was through Adam. That's where the judgment and the condemnation came from. But the free gift is of many offenses unto justification. Verse 17 says, for if by one man's offense death reigned by that one, much more they which receive the abundance of grace, that's us, and the gift of righteousness, that's us. you should ponder that for a moment. The gift of righteousness means the gift of being saved